I was 7 months pregnant the first night I slept on a folding cot in my mother-in-law's garage, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of motor oil, listening to my husband's footsteps pace back and forth in the house above me, while he decided, apparently, whether or not this was a problem worth solving. I want to start there, with that specific detail, because I think people hear a story like this and assume it must have happened suddenly, in one dramatic moment. It didn't. It happened slowly, one small accommodation at a time, until one day I looked up and realized I was sleeping next to a lawnmower while carrying my first child. My name is Renata, and this is the story of how I spent 11 months being made to feel like a guest in my own life, and the one piece of paper that finally ended it. I met my husband, Thomas, through my job. I was an architect at a mid-sized firm, 6 years into my career. Proud of the work I'd built for myself, Thomas worked in commercial real estate, which is how our paths crossed in the first place. A mutual project, a series of meetings that turned into dinners, and eventually a relationship that felt, in those early months, refreshingly uncomplicated. He was warm. He was affectionate in front of other people, which I'd learned to value after a previous relationship with someone who wasn't. And he loved his mother, which I initially took as a good sign. A man who's close with his mother, I used to think, is a man who knows how to love a woman well. I did not yet understand that there is a difference between a man who loves his mother and a man who has never once, in his entire adult life, been asked to choose between her and anyone else. His mother, Beatriz, was polite to me in the beginning, in the careful, appraising way of someone conducting a long interview. She asked about my family, my career, my plans. I answered honestly, proudly even, because I had nothing to hide, and no reason to think I needed to perform for her. It wasn't until Thomas and I got engaged that her tone began, subtly at first, to shift. Small comments about how career women often struggled to prioritize family. Observations, delivered as though they were compliments, about how traditional I seemed despite my job, as though those two things were naturally in tension, and she was pleasantly surprised I hadn't fully committed to one side. We married 18 months after we met, in a ceremony Beatriz had opinions about at every stage. The venue, the guest list, even, memorably, the color of my dress, which she felt was a bit bold for someone marrying into her family. I let most of it go. I told myself, the way many young brides tell themselves, that a mother's involvement in a wedding is simply love expressed clumsily, and that once we were married and settled into our own life, the dynamic would ease. It did not ease. If anything, it intensified once I got pregnant. We had been living in a rental apartment across town, 20 minutes from Beatriz's large house, which Thomas's late father had built decades earlier, and which she had lived in alone since his death. When our lease came up for renewal in my 5th month of pregnancy, right around the same time my firm scaled back hours due to a slow quarter, Thomas suggested, gently, reasonably, the way he always suggested things that later turned out not to be reasonable at all, that we move in with his mother temporarily, save money before the baby came, have extra help nearby. I remember him saying, "It's just until we're back on our feet. She has so much space." I agreed, against a quiet instinct I chose to override, because I told myself I was being paranoid, that a temporary arrangement during a financially tight pregnancy was simply practical, not a warning sign. We moved into the house's largest guest room in my 6th month. The shift in Beatriz's behavior once we were under her roof happened faster than I expected. and it happened in small enough increments that I kept second-guessing my own reaction to each one. First, it was comments about how I loaded the dishwasher incorrectly. Then it became a rule, delivered without discussion, that I wasn't to use the good china even for simple meals, because it had sentimental value she didn't trust me to respect. Then it became something closer to surveillance. She began keeping track, out loud, of how much food I ate from the pantry, framing it as concern for my health, though the tone never quite matched the words. The turning point, the one I still think about most, happened on a Tuesday evening near the end of my 7th month. I had come home exhausted from a long day helping close out a project at the firm, feet swollen, back aching in the specific way that only late pregnancy produces, and found that Beatriz had rearranged the guest room while I was at work. My things, maternity clothes, the small collection of baby items I'd already begun collecting, my laptop and work files, had all been moved out and stacked neatly in boxes in the hallway. In their place, she had set up the room for her visiting sister, who I learned, standing there in the hallway looking at my own boxed belongings, was arriving the following week for an extended stay. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" I asked her, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "The garage has that lovely cot from when Thomas was in Scouts," she said, not looking up from the linens she was folding. "It's only for a few weeks, dear. Family comes first." I want to be clear about something. I was 7 months pregnant, and my mother-in-law had just informed me, with the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans, that I would be sleeping in a garage so her visiting sister could have a proper bed. I turned to Thomas, who was standing in the doorway, and waited for him to say something, anything, that indicated he understood how insane this arrangement was. He didn't say much. He said, "It's just for a few weeks. Let's not make it a whole thing." And that sentence, "let's not make it a whole thing," became, over the following months, the refrain that defined my entire relationship with both of them. The garage cot was not, in fact, only for a few weeks. Beatrice's sister's extended stay turned into 2 months, and by the time she finally left, Beatrice had discovered how convenient the arrangement was for her, and simply never offered to move me back. I slept on that cot, wrapped in a blanket that never fully lost the smell of the garage, for the final 10 weeks of my pregnancy. I gave birth to my daughter, Isabel, and came home from the hospital to that same garage, because by then Beatrice had decided the guest room, freshly redecorated, would make a lovely nursery for visiting family, meaning, apparently, anyone except us. I want to pause here and explain why I didn't simply leave during those months, because I know that's the question most people ask when they hear a story like this. The honest answer is complicated. I was financially stretched from the reduced hours at my firm. Thomas kept promising, in quiet, late-night conversations, that this was temporary, that he'd talk to his mother, that things would change once the baby settled in. I believed him, or wanted to believe him, in the specific way exhausted new mothers sometimes convince themselves that endurance is the same thing as strength. And underneath all of it, I think I was still operating on the assumption that Beatrice's cruelty, however petty, had some kind of ceiling, that eventually, surely, she would soften once she saw her granddaughter. She did not soften. If anything, Isabel's arrival gave Beatrice new material. She criticized how I held her, how I fed her, how I dressed her for the weather. She began referring to Isabel in front of guests as the baby, rarely by name, as though naming her too fully might grant me some legitimacy Beatrice wasn't ready to concede. Meanwhile, I was still sleeping in the garage, now with a bassinet wedged between the cot and a stack of paint cans, waking every 2 hours to nurse a newborn in a room that dropped 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house every night. The moment everything changed happened almost by accident, 4 months after Isabel was born, and it started with something as mundane as property tax mail. I had gone into the main house one afternoon to grab something from the kitchen while Isabel napped, and found a stack of mail on the counter that Beatriz had apparently left out while sorting through old paperwork. She'd been dealing, I would later learn, with updating some estate documents after her sister's visit had stirred up old family business. Among the papers was a property tax statement for the house we were all living in. I wasn't trying to snoop. I genuinely just needed a pen, and in moving papers aside to find one, my eye caught the name on the deed line. It wasn't Beatriz's name alone, as I had always assumed. It was Thomas's name, too. Jointly listed alongside hers, a detail I later learned traced back to an estate planning decision his late father had made years earlier, structuring the property so that ownership would pass smoothly to his son rather than getting tangled in probate. Beatriz had lived in that house and controlled every square inch of it, and made every decision about who slept where and under what conditions, while legally owning only half of it. I did not say anything to Beatriz that day. I said something, quietly and carefully, to Thomas that night, after Isabel was finally asleep in her bassinet in the garage. I asked him directly whether he knew his name was on the deed to his mother's house. He said he did know, vaguely, that his father had set something up years ago, but that he'd never really thought about what it meant in practice, because it was just his mother's house, in every way that mattered day to day. I asked him whether he understood, then, that as a legal co-owner of the property, he had every right to make decisions about who lived where within it, including, for instance, deciding that his wife and daughter would sleep in an actual bedroom instead of a garage. I watched something shift in his face that night, a kind of dawning realization that had apparently never occurred to him in 4 months of watching me nurse our daughter next to a lawnmower. I think, in fairness to him, Thomas's failure was less active cruelty than a lifelong habit of never questioning his mother's authority in her own domain. A habit so deeply ingrained, he'd never thought to check whether that authority was actually as absolute as she'd always presented it. The following morning, Thomas did something he had not done once in the previous 4 months. He told his mother, calmly but firmly, that Renata and Isabel would be moving into the guest room that day, and that the garage arrangement was over. Beatriz's response was, to put it mildly, not gracious. She argued that the guest room needed to stay available for family. Thomas, for the first time I'd witnessed, pointed out that his wife and daughter were family, and that his name was on the deed to this house exactly as much as hers was, and that he intended, starting today, to start acting like it. I moved into the guest room that afternoon. I remember sitting on an actual bed, holding Isabel, feeling a kind of relief so physical it was almost dizzying, and understanding, for the first time in months, exactly how much unnecessary suffering I had absorbed simply because I hadn't known, because none of us had ever bothered to check exactly what rights I already had through my husband, sitting unused the entire time. The dynamic in the house did not become warm after that. Beatriz remained cold, occasionally pointed in the months that followed, and eventually, 6 months after the deed conversation, Thomas and I used savings we'd rebuilt to move into our own place, a modest 2-bedroom across town where Isabel finally had a real nursery, with real walls and real heat, instead of a garage that smelled like motor oil and cold concrete. I think about that folded cot sometimes, usually on nights when Isabel, older now, asks for an extra blanket because her room is chilly, and I get to walk down a real hallway to get her one instead of stepping over paint cans in the dark. I think about how close I came to simply accepting that arrangement as permanent. The way you can talk yourself into accepting almost anything if it happens slowly enough. One small accommodation at a time, without ever seeming, in any single moment, worth fighting over. What finally changed things wasn't a confrontation or a dramatic scene. It was a piece of paper I wasn't even looking for, sitting on a kitchen counter, telling me a truth about my own situation that I had simply never thought to check. I've thought a great deal, since then, about how much power sits quietly in the things we never bother to verify for ourselves, how easily we accept someone else's version of the rules, simply because they say them with enough confidence, and how much can change the moment you finally look at the actual paperwork yourself, instead of taking someone's word for what it says. If you've ever found yourself accepting an arrangement that felt wrong but hard to name, hard to fight, hard to justify leaving over any single incident, I want you to know that sometimes the answer isn't a bigger fight. Sometimes it's simply finding the one piece of information that was true all along, sitting quietly in a drawer or a folder, waiting for someone to finally read it properly. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever discovered something that changed the entire balance of a situation you thought you had no power in? Subscribe to Quiet Reckoning for a new story every week.